Welcome everybody to another CPAC Live. As you all know, that I'm going to be getting an airplane pretty soon here and joining my lovely wife Mercedes out in Green Bay for CPAC Wisconsin on Friday. If you want to join us, and I know a lot of people do, we've even heard from people around the country who are tired of just kind of hanging out in their neighborhood or in their house, who want to come be with great Americans and great conservatives. So you can go to cpac.org to check on ticket status. You do have to sign up. Of course, you can show up for the event itself. And Wisconsin is a great state to be in. I'm hoping it's just a little bit cooler and filled with wonderful people. And Wisconsin's going to be an awfully important state in November in going forward. On today's show, we're going to be joined by two great guests. Andy McCarthy, who you all know has written many great books, including most recently Ball of Collusion, which I have not been able to find anything in that book that was in error on the big themes here, what people have been saying to you for years about the outrageous lawlessness of the Obama-Biden administration, especially towards the tail end, is a story I think that's worse than all the Watergate books and movies I was forced to consume as a child and as a student. We're also going to be joined by Acting Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, Ken Cuccinelli, who's a wonderful conservative, obviously spoken to our CPAC community so many times, and has this very important job for the Department of Homeland Security to put into practice this whole concept of law and order, which people told us was fascistic, that this was an example of right-wing fascism, that we would use these terms law and order. Well, now these liberals and socialists in our big cities, tragically, and the people who have to live under their reign, tragically, are seeing what happens when people just act in a violent and lawless way, because what you actually read about is stores being looted, kids being shot, people of color fearing for their lives. You look at all these polls that have come out recently, you actually see people of color, you see Black Americans that are expressing quiet but very strong support for the police. Doesn't mean that they don't understand that we don't need to constantly be vigilant with police training and police reforms, but they understand that that thin blue line is what separates them from the violence that could take their sons and daughters and themselves as well. So we're going to be talking about all these themes. So we're going to start with Andy McCarthy, who you see on your TV screens often. Read his great columns for National Review, and as I mentioned, is a best-selling author. Andy McCarthy, thanks for being with us again on CPAC Live.
Matt, my pleasure.
So, when we talk together, we can talk about anything, but I think the thing that was uppermost on my mind, the violence, of course, is very, very distressing. I live here in the D.C. area. I assume you are hanging out in the New York City area. This is very, very troubling, but there's another theme that's very troubling, which is this whole concept of our individual rights and our individual liberties, especially the First Amendment, our right to have political speech, our right to get together, our right to go to church or not go to church, to practice our faith, to practice no faith. These things are woven in every American in their understanding of their relationship with their government. As you read these headlines of these mostly socialist governors like Gavin Newsom and others arresting Christians for trying to go to church while they paint Black Lives Matter on their streets and seem to have a welcome mat for crime and violence, what's your reaction?
Well, I think as a lawyer, it's frustrating, Matt, and as someone who follows history, it's both frustrating, but I see that there's perhaps a silver lining. Let me do that first.
Could I please hear the silver lining? Because I really need to hear something about a silver lining.
Yeah, I think there is one, because, when I tell people this, it's almost out of the historical memory of people. But for example, in 1971, which is like ancient history to a lot of people who go to school nowadays and think that life began like in 2010 or something.
Right.
There were 1,900 bombings in the United States. 1,900. I think we often forget that we actually went through a period of time like this. It's near and dear to me because I grew up in the Bronx in the 1960s and 70s, which was a time of very high crime. You were just laying out, I think, very succinctly and well the concerns that people have just trying to go out of their homes and walk from place to place in their own neighborhoods. We've had like a generation of domestic tranquility that began in the early 1990s up until very recently. And I think, unfortunately, it's out of the historical memory of a lot of people that we went through a period of very high crime and lots of domestic terrorism, very much of the type that we're seeing now. Back then, it was the Weather Underground, which were a bunch of basically privileged white kids from a lot of Ivy League schools, particularly in the area that I was in. And a lot of them were conspiring with groups like the Black Panthers and the Black Liberation Army. So this period that we're going through now has fairly recent historical parallels. And I think the fact that we came out of it and we actually had that generation of domestic tranquility is hopeful.
Can I interrupt you just for a
Yeah,
second?
of course.
My parents were New Yorkers, and as a young man, I lived as a boy, I lived right outside New York City in New Jersey, and this was the late 70s,
Right.
76 to 80, and I remember that even my parents who grew up in the city, the idea of going into the city brought with it real concern over personal safety. You thought twice about bringing your kids with you. You wouldn't go around at night. I remember we would, if we ever went into the city, we would be sure to get out of there by the night. You had things like the Son of Sam killer and stuff. And it's like you had this idea of crime being out of control. And it seems like we got rid of that and we've forgotten that can happen again.
Yeah, we did. And, this is a thing that works with domestic policing. It works in national security as well. This rule of thumb, which is if you have a period of time where you successfully quell a threat, I think what happens is people want to think, just because of human nature, that maybe the threat wasn't so bad in the first place, rather than maybe it's all the precautions that we were taking that quelled the threat, that kept it down, and that take a lot of patience and persistence in order to keep in place. And right now we're experimenting with exactly what we experimented in the 60s and 70s, which is this kind of left-wing government. In the 60s and 70s, we had a revolution in the rights of criminals, which was up to that point unknown in American history, and going forward has been tamped down on. I think if you go back to the cases of the 80s and 90s, but that period of time in the 60s and 70s, what was most famous about it was this image of revolving door justice, where the bad guys were getting back out on the street while the cops were still at the desk filling out the paperwork for the arrest. I mean, that was how bad it got. So we had to do a lot of stuff beginning in the 1990s with intelligence policing to tamp down on that. The other thing that's important, I think, to what you asked me about at the beginning, is what's frustrating as a lawyer is while we have the Bill of Rights, and the whole reason to have the Bill of Rights is so that we don't have to go to court to enforce our rights. That's supposed to be almost self-actuating in this society. But as we know, it's not. We have historic periods throughout our history where governments get very aggressive on people in times of crisis. And what's frustrating as a lawyer is that the history of our country is that mostly is controlled by politics rather than law. Because as a practical matter, courts never want to jump in the middle of a crisis. They don't want to be accountable for it. So what ends up happening is these executives, whether at the state level or the federal level, get a lot of leeway to do a lot of things, including things they shouldn't do while the crisis takes place. And then what happens is people sue in court, and those cases get decided after the crisis is over. So maybe they set norms for the next crisis, but that's kind of cold comfort to people in the here and now.
So when you have rampant crime and when you had these kind of ACLU kind of results out of the courts, including the Supreme Court, on really making it harder to put hardened criminals away, which we all want to do. Even those of us who say, look, sometimes we give prosecutors too much leeway in things that are in nonviolent crime, especially, doesn't mean that we want to have violent thugs around on our streets. When you go through a period of time like that, I don't think we've ever seen so much of a clampdown at the same time of law-abiding citizens' ability to do things that we've done for almost 250 years in this country, like go to church or decide where you want to send your kid to school, especially if that school's going to be open 5 days a week, with responsible precautions and everything else. When you see Gavin Newsom basically arresting old women going to church and these types of things, have we ever seen this before?
Well, we've certainly seen overstepping by executives. I've never seen it in the 20th century forward in a way that looks like overt hostility to religious liberty. And I think one thing that we're very fortunate to have in this administration is a Justice Department that is animated by civil rights. So under Attorney General Barr, the Civil Rights Division has filed lawsuits in various municipalities around the country where they have clamped down on religious liberty. And the argument the Justice Department has made is basically based on equal treatment under the law, which is to say, if you're going to allow a business to operate and have a conference room where they have to have meetings, if they're a law firm or an accounting firm, if you're going to let a fast food place operate so that people have to come up to the window and transact and all that stuff, you can't tell people that they cannot exercise their religion in a communal way, particularly if they are observing all of the sensible social distancing protocols that we are familiar with now. So I think it's very helpful that the Justice Department has done that. It would have been more helpful if the Supreme Court had backed them in the one case where this came up recently. Instead, we unfortunately yet again saw Chief Justice Roberts vote with the liberal bloc.
How do you describe that? How do you characterize that? How do we make sense of what John Roberts, a man who, we were all told is a man of deep faith, and not that that should impact your decisions on the court, but somebody who certainly respected the idea of the First Amendment and our right to practice our faith. How has he been such a disappointment, especially on something so fundamental?
I think we may have misjudged what his compass is. I personally think that he's a very brilliant lawyer, and he's a right of center guy in terms of his political orientation, I think. But what motivates him most, or I think what his compass is that he is an institutionalist about the court. And I think he over-worries about what the reputation of the court is, particularly with people who may not necessarily be the court's friend.
But you're being a little generous. I think he's also overly concerned with his own reputation.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think he sees them as bound up together because he's the Chief Justice. So this is known as the Roberts Court, right? So it's the direction. You're right. It's the direction he personally is taking it. But, I've seen cases, particularly the Little Sisters of the Poor case, which is, I think, a temporary victory for religious liberty at the end of the last term. That should have been a sweeping victory. But rather than decide the core religious liberty question at the heart of the case, he opted, in order to get a 7-2 win rather than a 5-4 win, to take a narrow, statutory construction point that he could get 7 justices, including 2 of the lefties, into the majority, because he would rather have the country, in his mind, think, oh, what a collegial, nonpartisan institution, rather than just make the right legal decision and the rest of it, including history, will take care of itself. I think that's the problem.
When they paint Black Lives Matter in front of the White House, in front of Trump Tower, we see the violence coming out of Chicago, where there's also a Trump property, which seems to be a rallying cry for people. It seems innocuous, right? Of course, Black Lives Matter. Of course, we want civil rights for all. Our country has faced down these challenges and made the right, responsible decisions. But of course, this also seems to be a rallying cry to say that, well, violence is somewhat acceptable if it's done because you are trying to demonstrate against racism, which of course is completely abhorrent to what we believe in this country, that you can't take your political beefs out on innocent people or innocent store owners, and you can't burn down churches, can't rip down statues. There's a legal process to decide on statues and things like that. Same thing is true on the other side with this question of civil rights and specifically our First Amendment rights. If they can, what you're basically saying is they're persecuting the little sisters of the poor. This Obamacare mandate, which forces them to pay for abortion-inducing drugs for their employees, because nuns, this is going to come as a big shock to Obama, Biden people, but nuns really don't need contraceptives. This is, I know it's a newsflash. Not every woman needs a contraception, folks. And it's not a war on women when you tell women that that's an individual choice they can make. They can legally purchase contraception. But it becomes a war on women when you mandate it, because essentially they would make being a nun in America illegal, because you'd have to violate your conscience in order to operate as an order in this country. When you go after nuns, which are a tiny, tiny part of our population, isn't it inevitable that you just go after all people of faith?
Yeah, of course it is. And what it really shows, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head with the last part, which is that there's such a tiny group. What it should say to everyone, which is very frightening, is that in terms of the culture war, the social justice warriors want complete victory. They don't want to accommodate. They don't want to live in a pluralistic society where everybody has a point of view and we all have to kind of make room for each other. If they're going to get any brushback, their approach is to scorch the earth. It is not to compromise. And that's really not the American idea. And this really goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning. I think the Students for Democratic Action, or for Democratic Society, which ultimately became the Weather Underground, those people didn't end up in jail. They ended up on college campuses, and they got
pardoned. And they got pardoned by Barack Obama. Some of them are involved in the funding mechanism that Act Blue funds, that now funds Black Lives Matter Incorporated.
Susan Rosenberg.
What'd you say?
Susan Rosenberg.
That's right. That's right. And others were actual advisors to Barack Obama. So, it's not a stretch to say the radicalism of the 60s and 70s that you talked about, they've been kind of able to mainstream themselves into advisors to major Democrats.
Yeah, they realized at a certain point that it was, especially when you're dealing with the schools, that taking over the building was better than blowing up the building. And they actually did have a plan for how you turn the classroom into an indoctrination lab. And as somebody who does...
With our money, Andy. All
yes,
of our tuition money, all of our tax money, all of our property tax money, we funded all these creeps to destroy and pollute the minds of our children.
Yep. And you and I get the same question all the time, Matt, which is how do we turn it around? And this is the hard work that you have to tell people about. But if you turn the institutions of opinion over to the left for 3 generations, that's not a Titanic or a big old ship that we can turn around in a second. It really requires rolling up your sleeves and taking them on in the battle of ideas. And it requires a lot of commitment because there's no final victories. They've been fighting this. I mean, if you want to take the progressive era back to the beginning, they've been fighting this for a century, and they've been doing fabulously well. But that was because they were willing to kind of gradually win until it got to a critical mass. And now we're dealing with the critical mass.
And this is why we get up every day at CPAC. And as you know, Andy, we deal a lot with high school and college kids. We get up every day and try to make these arguments. There's other great center-right groups that are doing the same. I think a lot of parents are rethinking where they send their kids to school. A lot of them are rethinking just putting them into the public school system where this indoctrination is so enriched. But also in private schools, our experience is that private schools, even Christian and Catholic schools, are not immune to these forces. If you're going to be a parent, you're going to be very active in pushing back on these really basic principles. And, finally, Andy, as we let you get back to your busy day of attacking these really bad, forces in our society, what's your advice to a parish priest, to a pastor, to a bishop, to a minister, as they're being told they have to shut down because otherwise they're a mass murderer, which is literally being said on social media if you don't shut down your religious institution. What's your advice on what the Constitution, what rights they have as a pastor or priest or principal of a religious school? Can they push back against these state authorities that I believe are overstepping their boundaries?
I think the best weapon that they have, if they want to think about the legal landscape, is the Justice Department. And we do get federal pushback now against these states. The problem is, as just one individual person, you often feel just overwhelmed by the trends and the forces that are arrayed against you.
And they're doing that purposely. They want to isolate you, shame you, make you feel like what you're doing is irresponsible and now unhealthy.
Yeah, that's right. But I also think you can't get your expectations too high about what you can accomplish, especially in the law. So what I always tell people is the way I try to do it myself, which is, take care of your business around you and do the best you can. And it's still a great country, one foot in front of the other, and we go.
Okay, well, let's do it together. Let's keep doing it together. And our CPAC community appreciates everything that you're saying and doing to try to make sure that we push back on these really radical. We have this question about, in the old days, we'd say, well, someone was a communist. And in the 50s, we were told that was a terrible slur, that you're indicting somebody for what they feel in their heart. Now you have a left that's just embracing socialism and communism. So I guess it's a fair game to say what they are. But we at CPAC continue to think that it's not consistent with the ideals of America to embrace communism, to embrace Marxism, to embrace socialism, and certainly to embrace violence. And Andy McCarthy, we appreciate your sane voice on all these topics. Thanks for joining us again on CPAC Live. And we're going to be right back with Secretary Ken Cuccinelli after this short video.
Yeah, police were caught off guard by the violence Friday night. 49 officers injured. 18 of them went to the hospital after projectiles and fireworks were thrown at them during that protest. Now the superintendent today ordered all of his officers to wear any and all protective gear when covering protests. We must warn you, some of you may find this video disturbing. Police video captured a violent attack on officers who were protecting the statue of Christopher Columbus during a protest Friday night in Grant Park.
What began as a peaceful protest at Grant Park Friday evening devolved into a very dangerous situation in which mob action deliberately sought to injure officers.
The mayor decried the violence, calling those responsible vigilantes. The police video showed one person dumping out a backpack with what appeared to be frozen water bottles, which were then thrown at officers. Demonstrators also hurled fireworks, one sergeant suffering a broken eye socket from the shrapnel. Police said the PVC pipe used to hold the Black Lives Matter banners had been sharpened and were taken out and used to jab at officers.
Just seeing those images out of Portland and out of Chicago, and you turn on your TV screen and you see these images of these violent agitators who the Attorney General said the other day were really revolutionaries. It's quite something to see, and it's also something to see these mayors, basically socialist mayors, now saying, hey, enough is enough. Because eventually, if you allow violence to occur on your streets, even if you try to sugarcoat it with the idea that it's a peaceful protest, but if you allow this violence to take place on your streets, if you encourage it as a political leader, eventually it gets out of control. And what we're seeing from people like the mayor of Portland is a realization that innocent people will be killed if you don't have law and order. And our next guest, who we're really honored to have with us, understands that more than anyone. Ken Cuccinelli, who's the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. Secretary Cuccinelli, thanks for being with us today.
Good to be with you, Matt.
So you're really at the point of the spear on all these questions about what the federal government to aid and assist well-meaning city leaders who are trying to keep some civility in their neighborhoods, and also working with, unfortunately, some city leaders who seem to be just fine with the idea that a violent mob can take over. Give us a status report on the important work your agency's doing.
So the DHS, you've obviously seen what we've been doing in Portland for a number of months now, and what we're not doing. We're not patrolling the streets of Portland. We're not doing a lot of general policing. What we are doing is protecting federal facilities, and asking the locals to step up and cooperate. We try to work together with local law enforcement. And in almost all of the country, except Portland, that happens regularly and smoothly. And it creates a better use of their officers and our officers to achieve peace in a variety of ways. And I'll give you an example. So in Chicago, which has had a stubborn streak of higher violence in the last number of months, we have advanced a number of Homeland Security investigators who are really gang specialists, among other things, but that is one of the things they're really uniquely good at, and participating with our Department of Justice partners in cooperation with the Chicago Police Department. So, and their sheriff's office there. Again, the key there is cooperation. And so we are working with them to reduce the neighborhood violence by going after some of the leading agents of that violence in, especially for us, in the international gangs, things like MS-13 and Latin Kings and so forth. So you compare that to Portland, where the city council won't let the police talk to us, where the state police, until the end of July, stubbornly stayed out. The governor refused to bring in the National Guard. You have all sorts of just restrictions after restrictions. And what's the difference? You get, I'm not going to call it protester violence, because protesters by definition aren't violent. They're exercising First Amendment rights peacefully. But you have rioters, and you have what amounts of domestic terrorism going on in much of Portland. Whereas Chicago, really what you have is a severe case of violent crime. It's not politically driven, it's criminally driven. Major difference, and that's something that we're helping out by partnership in all sorts of parts of the country, whether it's Kansas City, your home area there, and or Chicago, and we could rattle on other cities around the country where we're working cooperatively at the president's insistence to try to help bring down the violence.
Right, and that's the proper relationship that we have in this federal system, right? Which is, there are things that the national government should do. There are things that the local government, the state government should do. One of the things that's worried me in this whole effort to defund local police forces is, if you didn't have well-funded and effective local police forces, that would inevitably lead to a very powerful national police force, which is not what you're describing with what you're doing, but it is the goal of some people from a policy standpoint, and that's problematic.
Yeah, that really isn't consistent with our federalist system, and the president has been very clear. He wants us to be aggressive in advancing law enforcement, but he's very clear about us staying within the boundaries of the law. He is very concerned that people are having their rights denied, whether you're a shop owner in downtown Seattle or Portland, or as we saw this past weekend, Chicago, with the looting that broke out there on a false story. That is a great concern to him. And I've listened to him say in conversation, I'm everybody's president. Whether I get along with these cities or not, I'm still their president. And he has a great concern for the safety of the individuals who live there and of the opportunities represented by the businesses to function there. And the question then becomes, at the federal level, what's appropriate and what are we capable of doing to help make those safe arenas in which to live and work?
We're in a highly politicized environment, obviously. There are those on the left that started talking about resistance from the very first moment that President Trump put his hand on the Bible. But I have to think, behind all of that kind of cancerous politics, that there are a lot of people that just love their cities. And there are people, I know, people in Chicago who love Chicago, and the same for New York City, and the same for, I'm sure, Portland and Seattle, that they can't love the fact that these cities are being destroyed and their residents are being terrorized by this violence.
Yeah, I want to say it was a couple of days ago, I think the largest protest that I've seen in Portland, now I may have missed some in June, I wasn't following every single day from May on, was by people opposing the effort that's being voted on this week in the Portland City Council, the reduction of funding of police. I think there were 5,000 people at that protest outside City Hall. And by the way, that one was peaceful. And these are folks who want to keep their police viable. They probably don't want their hands tied, as this mayor has often done, and frankly, as have their local courts, where we've got courts getting into the business of how to conduct policing. You can or can't use tear gas under these or that circumstances. We're going to order you to accept legal observers, like this is a UN mission or something. And this is going on. This is coming from state judges, it's coming from federal judges, and it's really a new form of outrageous political activism by judges.
So you properly put a dividing line between peaceful protesters or people who just want to voice concerns,
right,
and then people who want to do violence to other human beings, violence to property, terrorize people. Those are two very different groups. The Attorney General keeps talking about how the revolutionaries or the agitators or the real leftist Marxist elements to some of these movements, how they like to try to infiltrate maybe the more peaceful protests. And I always wonder, is there a foreign, a lot of people like to talk about Russian collusion, which turned out to be a complete hoax, but there are foreigners that want to create complete division in our society. That is true. And they can exploit these opportunities to try to undermine America. Do you see evidence of that, or is that something that we'll find out in the future?
Well, absolutely, Matt. And but it's in the influence arena. It's not that there's any evidence that they're funding this or planning it or anything. Right. But I'll give you one example. I was on the phone talking with some of my colleagues about one of the viral videos out of the riots that included a video of Customs Border Protection agents arresting someone, not arresting, but detaining someone who matched the description of someone who had assaulted some law enforcement officers. So that video happened on a Thursday. And so I just Googled to pull it up so I could look at it again. And you know how it brings up images. The very first article underneath was RT.com. That's RussiaTimes.com. And they were trying to make the president look bad and to sow division. And the way they do it is they find these hot spots, whether it's Ferguson, whether it's Portland, whatever it could be, George Floyd's killing. And then they get on both sides and they fan the flames on both sides to drive division in our country. And, we don't need any help, thank you, unfortunately. But that is one way they do that. And whether it's the Russians or the Chinese or the Iranians, those are the biggest players trying to use this dissension to sow seeds of discord and to destabilize our country. And so it is absolutely being used, but all of that is sort of at the news and influence level. It's on the internet, it's social media accounts. It isn't attempts to organize and to participate. It's more to amplify and to fan the flames.
And then locally, you have this whole question about people funding people that are trying to cause violence on the streets.
Yes.
I assume that our CPAC community will be reassured that there are a lot of things that they read and hear about that you are doing. And then there are other things that you're probably less public about in order to make sure that, we don't lose control of these cities.
Right. Well, to put it in the simplest terms, it doesn't happen quickly, but there are literally hundreds of investigations running right now all over the country related to the violence and instigating the violence. We want to protect the peaceful protesters, but not the instigators of violence. And I would share with your viewers, I would urge you to go look at the July 20th press conference by Chicago Police Superintendent Brown, where he, in 14 minutes, he walked through how a peaceful protest that they were protecting morphed into a clearly broad-scale planned attack on his officers This was when they were attacking at the Christopher Columbus statue, and 49 of his police officers were injured. And you see with overhead video, he zeroes in on people changing clothes and changing their not only what they're wearing, but what they're holding, the use of umbrellas. Hey, I'm peaceful. I'm just holding an umbrella. Yeah, I'm shielding the guy who's launching the ballista at the police. So am I really a peaceful protester any longer? No, I'm aiding and abetting an assault on officers. And so he shows all those pieces all in 14 minutes. And I would urge anybody watching you and I talk about this subject, that is a worthwhile press conference to watch. He did a great job on it, very clear. And he's clearly a passionate professional, wants to keep his officers safe, and he wants to keep his community safe. He oftentimes has political leaders that tie his hands, much like we see in Portland and other places. But that press conference is a genuine learning experience that every American should watch.
Mr. Secretary, what we'll do is we're going to go. I saw pieces of it, but we'll make this commitment to you. We'll go pull it back up and share it with this community, because I agree with you. It's important for people to understand. And I wonder this, as police are victimized, as they are defunded, this is just a clear onslaught to demoralize and weaken local police forces. But we've all seen a lot of movies and TV shows, and there's always this kind of animosity between federal forces, local forces. There's a marble cake of different types of law enforcement and first responders at different parts of government. As law enforcement generally is so unfairly savaged, despite the terrible tragedy of what happened in Minneapolis with George Floyd and other examples, policing, there's no way that anybody could argue that it's perfect. There are human beings.
And it never will be. It never will be. We just need to continue to try to improve.
But do you sense a greater kind of collegiality and camaraderie by everybody in law enforcement, federal level, local level, as a result of some of these atrocious local decisions?
There's a certain amount of us all being in the same boat together, but you also have some of these atrocious local decisions quite intentionally. Their purpose is to drive law enforcement apart. I mean, that's the target for much of it. And, when the Portland City Council illegalizes communication by the Portland Police Bureau with federal officers, they made it illegal. There's nowhere really for the professionals in the Portland Police Bureau to go. Unless they're going to start breaking their own laws. And we're not inviting that, but it is a sad, sad day when let's not kid ourselves, left-wing radical politicians start to dictate how policing isn't done. And I say isn't, I speak in the negative because they reduce options. And when they reduce the options of their own police, they create a less safe environment for their officers and their communities. And they are willing to do that. They're willing to sacrifice all these people for their political virtue signaling. And it is terrible. It's immoral.
We can't agree with you more, Mr. Secretary. Give us an update on what's going on with our border control, with the completion of the fence, the wall on our southern border, and just general. You've taken so many important steps to try to stem the flow of illegal immigration and to try to stop the perverse incentives we have in our society that allow this to happen. Are you feeling generally positive that you're making a lot of progress?
I believe so. I think one of the areas, one of the things I was asked, if you were to name one thing in the DHS sphere that people should keep in mind about what this president has done, what would it be? And my answer was, he's done what he said he would do. And when was the last time you saw that in the immigration space? Certainly, I can't name a Republican at a high level, certainly a president who's done that in our adult lifetimes. And he has achieved a lot. This president continues to push forward. We're over 275 miles of brand new, big, beautiful wall, as he would say. And it's a thorough system. It's got surveillance and backup roads so we can move quickly. It really does a lot for agent safety, not just interdiction. And we're frankly grateful to have it. And we're going roughly a mile a day now in the building, and continuing to accelerate. So I have no doubt we're going to hit the 450 miles by the end of the year. I think we'll easily hit 300 miles before the end of the summer, and we'll just keep on rolling. And that is a real benefit to America and our southern communities there along the border because of the safety factors involved, and to our agents. We need to protect our own as they protect us, and the wall does a lot of that. And on the regulatory side, the president has used long dormant legal authority to get rid of a lot of the gaming of the system that has gone on for years. Now here we have, perhaps more than anywhere, the politically active judges trying to weigh in and make policy. And I really wish these folks could just, go run for office. This is really, really ridiculous, because that's what they're trying to do, is to write laws by themselves.
No, this is right. And you're an accomplished lawyer. You were the Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And when I see the Chief Justice acting more like a county councilman or a state legislator than as a judge or a justice, it's upsetting. I personally have said the same thing. I think he needs to find a new line of work. We need judges who will simply interpret the law that the legislature passes. This is kind of basic civics.
It is basic civics, but apparently basic civics isn't something embraced heartily by every judge across this country. I will say one of the great areas of accomplishment for President Trump is not only has he picked a fair number of judges, but he's picked really good ones. And I actually think he is the best judge selector in history. I don't think there's been a better selection of judges since the founding era. It's kind of hard to judge against the John Marshalls of the world and so forth, but really when you get out of that era, once the Supreme Court had established itself, I don't think we've had a better leader president in picking judges than President Trump. And if he gets 4 more years, the impact will be even more incredible. But America's already a different place just for that.
I completely agree with you. It's really one of the legacies that a president leaves is the imprint he puts on the federal bench. And we can't be more pleased at the American Conservative Union with the types of men and women he selected for these positions. And I'm sure he's going to get many more picks in the future. Secretary Ken Cuccinelli, keep up the great work at the Department of Homeland Security. You probably didn't think this is what you'd be spending your time on, trying to help mayors, in some cases, some rather hapless mayors, try to restore law and order. But we appreciate very much that you're doing what needs to be done.
Most days I'm glad to do it, but I'm glad to be with you, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being a great friend to the CPAC community, and we appreciate you being on the show. And I want to remind everybody that we're going to be in Green Bay for CPAC Wisconsin on Friday. Go to our website at cpac.org and reserve your slots. I know people are pretty excited to get out and practice their First Amendment right to come together and talk about what's so special about this country, and also talk about why having a socialist version of America really isn't in our goal at all. Thanks for joining us on CPAC Live, and we'll see you again in 2 short days.